American English, American English. Teach and learn American English.
In this teaching tip topic, Eve will examine a sample lesson sequence and how to use a lesson sequence to incorporate news sources in the English language classroom. Welcome, Eve.
Here are today's goals. First, I'll present a sample lesson sequence, and after, we'll examine a lesson sequence that incorporates news sources in the English language classroom. One reason I like using news stories or articles in my class is because it's authentic language, or language meant for native speakers, and not something modified in order to teach a language. When using a current event, whether it's an article or a video from the internet, I generally follow these steps. Please pause if you'd like to take a look. So for this example sequence, I'm going to be referring to a news clip from NBC Nightly News, and the title is Teen Invents Sensor to Help Alzheimer's Patients. You can find this news clip online if you'd like to see it. Let's take a look at the first steps in our lesson sequence, facilitating the warm-up and presenting new vocabulary. So here are the two questions I hope to answer during a warm-up. What do my students know about this topic already? And what words do they use to talk about this topic? For this particular news clip, my warm-up questions are, what does it mean to have memory loss? And how does it happen? And the vocabulary words I chose to pre-teach were Alzheimer's, wandering, device, and triggers. So now that we've warmed up, it's time to watch the news clip and help the students understand the contents of the news clip before moving into the language-focused part of the lesson. Generally, I like to give my students comprehension questions that help focus their listening. This can be easy to create. My rule is no more than 8 questions per article or news clip. Sometimes I give the comprehension questions to my students before we read or listen, and sometimes I give them after. Next, we read or listen to the news story as many times as we need until we generally understand the contents of the news story. It's good to revisit those questions that the students created during the warm-up. They can become part of the lesson. Not all of the questions will be answered, but that leads to even more discussion. So for this particular news clip, here are some questions I created. Please pause if you'd like to take a look. So now that we've covered the contents of the news clip, it's time to focus on the language. So for this particular lesson, I chose a pronunciation focus. At this point in the lesson, I like to be clear about the objectives with my students and tell them why we're using news clips to study pronunciation. I tell students that studying examples of broadcast journalism is particularly interesting for language students because journalists read their lines in a certain way to maximize listening potential for their audience. Part of speaking clearly means planning out when to pause, when to stress, and when to use intonation patterns. We'll talk a little bit about what those are and how they add to the overall rhythm of a speaker. And then we'll use these markings below while listening to find where the journalist pauses between thought groups, which words or phrases the journalist stresses, and where the intonation patterns rise and fall. So here you can see I took a few of the sentences from the transcript. Notice I left the commas off the transcripts. I didn't want the punctuation to give any clues to my students about where the speaker might pause. I wanted them to listen for the pauses. And here you can see how the text looks when it's marked for thought groups, which are parts of a sentence between which there's a short pause. It's also marked for stress, or words that are emphasized. And lastly, for intonation, or the rising and falling of voice pitch. Let's check back in with the lesson sequence. Now we're ready for the application part of the lesson. How can students use these skills outside of this classroom activity? For this particular activity, I asked students to use the markings to imitate the speaker. I want them to try to pause when the journalist pauses, stress what the journalist stresses, and use the intonation patterns that the journalist uses. Then, for the next formal speaking assignment, I want them to mark their notes. I want them to think about how they can apply these speech features when they're trying to maximize listening potential, just like journalists do. Here are the steps to incorporate this activity into a pronunciation lesson. First, find a news clip online. Once you have a transcript or a couple of sentences you'd like the students to use, have them listen to the news clip 3 times, 1 time for each speech feature. I then ask them to imitate the speaker. I want them to practice inserting pauses and adding stress and intonation patterns. Finally, the last step is to apply these 3 features to something they've created. Summing up, today I showed you a sample sequencing lesson and how to use one in order to incorporate news sources into the ESL or EFL classroom. I hope you found this teaching tip helpful, and thanks again for watching.
To check out other great teaching tip videos, be sure to subscribe to our American English YouTube channel. You can find resources for teachers on the American English website by clicking on the link listed here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like us on the American English for Educators Facebook page.